My name is Mildred Shoemaker. I'm 30 years old, and I make a living predicting how things fall apart before they actually do. I'm an analyst by profession. Not the glamorous kind that ends up on magazine covers or gives TED Talks about disruption, but the quiet, methodical kind who sits with spreadsheets long after everyone else has gone home, tracing patterns that most people miss. I assess risk. I quantify loss. I decide with uncomfortable precision what something is truly worth and when it's time to walk away. For 2 years, I was convinced that love was the one variable I couldn't measure. My boyfriend Daryl Swain was everything I wasn't. Where I lived in forecasts and contingencies, Daryl lived in momentum. He was creative, charming, endlessly confident in ideas that arrived fully formed in his head and demanded immediate belief. He didn't plan, he envisioned. He didn't worry, he trusted the universe to catch him. For a long time, that felt intoxicating, like color flooding a grayscale life. We used to joke about it. I saw the world in columns and rows. He saw it in textures and mood boards. And somehow, for a while, those two ways of seeing didn't clash. They complemented each other. 8 months ago, Daryl came to me with what he called his biggest vision yet, a high-end curated consignment boutique. Not a thrift store, he was very clear about that. This would be exclusive, invitation only. A place where the city's elite could resell $5,000 handbags and last season runway pieces without ever admitting they were done with them. He spoke with conviction, with passion, with that particular glow people get when they're already living inside the success of an idea that hasn't happened yet. He wanted to call it Alon. Daryl had the dream. I had the capital. I didn't say yes right away. That's important. I didn't get swept up and write a check over dinner. I ran projections. I asked uncomfortable questions. I hired a lawyer. I formed an LLC. I put up $80,000 of my own savings, structured, properly documented, cleanly. I took an 80% ownership stake for my capital contribution. Daryl received 20% for sweat equity and creative direction. He teased me for it, said I was turning romance into a board meeting, said I took everything too seriously. I smiled and told myself that love didn't have to mean recklessness. For the first few months, it worked. Daryl was energized, sourcing inventory, sketching layouts, obsessing over lighting temperatures. I watched him come alive in a way I hadn't seen before, and I told myself the climbing startup costs were normal, necessary, temporary. Then 2 months ago, Lydia Vaughn reappeared. Daryl introduced her casually, almost offhand. His ex-girlfriend, a branding strategist he'd run into at a networking event. Lydia was polished, confident, and spoke in a language that felt deliberately slippery. Synergy, alignment, narrative, cohesion. She smiled at me like we were already allies, like she already knew how this would end. Almost immediately, Daryl's vision started needing Lydia's input. The logo wasn't bold enough. The website needed a complete overhaul. The brand story had to feel experiential. Each suggestion came with a price tag, and each time I hesitated, Daryl laughed it off. "You're overthinking it, Mildred," he said. "It's just a project." That was the first time I felt the chill. I didn't know it yet, but that word just was already doing a lot of damage. The first red flag wasn't emotional. It never is for me. It was a charge. I was sitting at my desk, late one Tuesday night, laptop balanced on the arm of the couch, half watching a muted news segment while reconciling the LLC's monthly expenses. I didn't need to do it myself. I had an accountant on retainer, but habits like mine don't turn off just because love is involved. I like to see the numbers with my own eyes. I like to know where things are bleeding before anyone else notices the stain. The charge was for $140, categorized as client strategy retreat, on a Monday night. At a hotel I knew by reputation alone, one of those boutique places with a rooftop spa, marble-soaking tubs, and an Instagram account that leaned heavily on candles and silk robes. The store wasn't even open yet. There were no clients. There was no reason for a retreat. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I highlighted the line item, made a note, and kept scrolling. That's when I saw the others. A $5,000 consulting fee to LV branding. Another one 6 days later. A $2 $100 laptop purchase marked as office hardware. An $800 luggage charge tagged inventory transport. Weekly dinners at a restaurant Daryl and I had only ever gone to once because I'd commented on the prices. I sat there very still as something familiar settled into my chest. Pattern recognition. The LLC debit card was in Daryl's wallet. He didn't have login access to the account that was intentional, but he could spend. And he had been, freely, casually, like it wasn't real money at all. When he came home that night, it was late, almost 11. I heard the door before I saw him. The soft thud of shoes kicked off the faint scent of champagne and a perfume that wasn't mine drifting down the hall. "Hey, Ev," he called, voice light, careless. "Sorry, long night." He leaned in to kiss me, but his mouth barely brushed my cheek, a near miss that felt more symbolic than accidental. I closed my laptop. "Daryl," I said evenly, "we need to talk." He sighed, already tired of the conversation he hadn't heard yet, and dropped onto the bar stool across from me. "Can it wait? Lydia and I were—" "No," I said, "it can't." I slid my phone across the counter, the screen already pulled up to the expense summary. I'd highlighted the worst of it in red. "These charges," I said, "they don't make sense. You've paid Lydia $10,000 in 2 weeks. And what exactly was the hotel retreat?" He barely glanced at the screen before rolling his eyes. "Oh my God, Mildred," he said, laughing under his breath. "Relax. It's networking. You have to spend money to make money." "At a spa?" I asked. "On a Monday." "Connections don't keep office hours," he shot back. "Lydia has access to people you'd never meet. That retreat was about the Q4 launch. Strategy, alignment. You wouldn't get it." I felt something tighten in my chest. "I get spreadsheets," I said quietly. "And the spreadsheet says we're burning through my investment on dinners, hotels, and vague invoices. So I'll ask you directly what's really going on between you and Lydia." That finally got his attention. He turned fully toward me, irritation sharpening his features like I'd just accused him of something deeply boring rather than deeply serious. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't make this weird." "I'm not making anything weird," I replied. "I'm asking a reasonable question." His expression shifted, then not defensive, not angry, just bored, annoyed, like I was an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. "You take everything too seriously," Daryl said. "It's just a project. It's just money." The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. "Just a project. My $80,000 was just a project." I stood up slowly. "What about us?" I asked. "Is that just a project too? Even love, Daryl?" He stared at me for half a second, and then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a reflexive one. A full, open, pitying laugh, like I'd said something naive, embarrassing. "God, Mildred," he said, "you're so heavy." He grabbed his jacket, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he picked up his keys, attached to a designer keychain I'd bought him, and glanced back at me with a smirk. "Lighten up," he said. "I'll be back later." And then he walked out. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, the echo of that laugh, ringing louder than any slammed door. It wasn't the sound of a fight. It was the sound of being dismissed. That's when something inside me went very still. He was right about one thing. I did take things seriously. I took him seriously. I took his dream seriously, and that apparently had been my mistake. If this was just a project to him, fine. I would treat it like one. A failed one. The night Daryl walked out, I didn't cry. That came later in small, inconvenient flashes, standing in line for coffee, folding laundry. Waking up at 3 in the morning with my chest tight and my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. But that first night after the door clicked shut and the apartment settled into silence, something far more dangerous happened. I went calm. Not the fragile, numb calm people mistake for healing. This was clarity. Cold, precise, almost comforting. The part of me that had built a career out of detaching emotion from outcome quietly stepped forward and took control. Daryl was right. I had taken him seriously. I wouldn't make that mistake again. I opened my laptop and emailed my lawyer. Her name was Natalie Brooks, and she'd been the one I insisted on hiring back when Daryl teased me for lawyering love. Natalie didn't do soft language. She did contingencies, worst-case scenarios, and contracts that assumed people would eventually disappoint you. She replied within 15 minutes. "I'm free tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring everything." The next morning, I sat across from her in her office glass walls, minimalist furniture, no personal photos. A woman who didn't blur boundaries for anyone. I handed her the operating agreement, the bank statements, the expense logs. She skimmed silently, flipping pages faster the deeper she went. Halfway through, she smiled. Not a kind one. "This," she said, tapping the paper, "is exactly why we draft ironclad agreements." I waited. "Mildred," she continued, "you own 80% of the LLC. You're the sole managing member. You're the only signatory on the lease and the bank account. You have every legal right to dissolve the company, liquidate the assets, and absorb the losses." "What about Daryl?" I asked. She shrugged. "He owns 20% of something that's about to stop existing. And the lease." "You'll owe a termination penalty," Natalie said. But that's a fixed loss. Staying in would be worse. I nodded. This was already aligning with the numbers in my head. Then she slid one document toward me. Before you do anything, she said, I suggest a full audit. That audit took all afternoon. By the time I finished pulling the itemized statements, the reality was no longer ambiguous, it was damning. Daryl hadn't just been careless, he hadn't just trusted the wrong person. He'd been stealing. $32,000. Straight out of the business account. Disguised as consulting travel equipment. The laptop. The luggage. The hotel charges coded as client meetings. Dinners that had nothing to do with business. Payments to Lydia's company that lined up perfectly with nights Daryl didn't come home. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. What I felt instead was something clean and absolute. This wasn't my boyfriend making bad decisions. This was a con. And I was done being the mark. I didn't confront him. I didn't send a long message explaining my pain. I didn't ask for closure. I followed procedure. Step 1, the account. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my ID and the LLC documents. I spoke calmly, clearly, and without drama. Within minutes, the account was frozen. Not closed, frozen. All transactions blocked, including the debit card Daryl carried so confidently in his pocket. I didn't have to wait long. 4 hours later, my phone rang. Mildred Darrell's voice came through, sharp and panicked. My card declined. I'm at the printer. They're waiting for the deposit for the grand opening invitations. I leaned back in my chair. Oh, I said lightly. That's strange. Fix it, he snapped. This is embarrassing. Lydia's here. The vendor's here. I murmured. Could be a security flag. Banks are cautious like that. Well, unflag it, he said. I need to pay Lydia. She's waiting on her consulting fee. Lydia needs her money. The audacity almost made me laugh. I'm a bit tied up with work, I said. You know how I am. Always taking things so seriously. There was a pause. What are you saying? He demanded. I'm saying you might need to cover it for now. With what he snapped. You know I don't have that kind of cash. That's unfortunate, I replied. We'll talk later. I ended the call. Then I blocked his number. The switch had flipped, and I wasn't switching it back. Once the account was frozen, everything else moved quickly. That's the thing about systems when you stop feeding them, they collapse on their own. By the next morning, I had 7 missed calls and a dozen messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Lydia apparently had decided that borrowing Daryl's phone was a reasonable workaround. I didn't read them. I archived the thread without opening a single text. There was nothing left to discuss, and I had work to do. Step 2 was the lease. The commercial space had always been in my name. Another decision Daryl had laughed about at the time. You really think I'm going to run off with a storefront? He'd joked. No, I thought someone might. I met the property manager that afternoon, a gruff man in his late 50s, who looked like he'd been negotiating commercial leases since before I was born. He skimmed the paperwork, then looked up at me with mild curiosity. She running it into the ground, he asked. She ran it, I corrected. Past tense. He exhaled slowly. 2-year lease, he said. You signed it. I know, I replied. What's the penalty? We negotiated for half an hour. He was tough, but pragmatic. I was motivated, but realistic. We settled on $15,000, 3 months' rent to terminate early. It wasn't cheap, but it was finite, a known loss. I wrote the check from my personal account without hesitation. The space needs to be broom swept and empty by the 20th, he said. That's 2 weeks. It'll be empty by Friday, I told him. And it was. Step 3 was the assets. I spent 3 long days inside what Daryl had proudly called our flagship location. I hired a consignment broker not to sell the inventory piece by piece, but to buy it outright. Speed mattered more than pride. The designer bags, the racks of clothing, the custom-built antique counter I'd spent $10,000 on because Lydia insisted it would anchor the brand narrative. The broker offered me 60 cents on the dollar. I accepted. I sold the lighting fixtures, the shelving, the velvet couch Lydia had demanded for client experience. By the end of the week, the store was nothing but concrete walls and dust, exactly what it had been when I first signed the lease. I left one thing behind, an old broom propped quietly in the corner. At home, I did the same. I packed my belongings methodically. Clothes, books, documents. Anything that was mine went into storage. The lease on the apartment was also in my name, another small miracle of foresight, and it expired at the end of the following month. I'd already submitted notice. Daryl hadn't come back. I assumed he was staying with Lydia. It didn't matter. By Friday night, I checked into a corporate hotel downtown. Clean lines, neutral colors, no memories. I slept better than I had in weeks. Here's the part that still amazes me. Daryl continued planning the grand opening. Somehow he found the money for the invitations. Borrowed it maybe. From Lydia. from his mother, from whoever still believed the story he was telling. He posted countdowns on social media, photos of champagne flutes and fabric swatches, captions about manifestation and vision. Alon grand opening, 3 weeks. He had no idea. No idea that the LLC was already dissolved, no idea the lease was terminated, no idea the store was empty and locked. He was inviting 100 people, investors, influencers, friends to a party in a concrete shell. The grand opening was scheduled for Tuesday. I marked it on my calendar, not out of spite, out of professional curiosity. I told myself I wouldn't go, that watching from a distance was enough, that knowing the outcome didn't require witnessing the impact. But that was a lie. I'm not cruel, but I am thorough. I needed to see the data play out in real time. So on Tuesday night, I sat at a wine bar directly across the street from what used to be Alon. The place had floor-to-ceiling windows and a clear line of sight to the storefront. I ordered a glass of Cabernet that cost more than I usually spent on an entire bottle, and a small cheese plate I didn't bother to share. I'd earned it. At 7:00 p.m. the caterers arrived. A white van pulled up. 2 men stepped out, clipboard in hand. They looked at the storefront, then at the large for lease sign taped neatly inside the glass. They exchanged glances. One of them made a phone call. I smiled into my wine. At 7:15, Daryl arrived. Not in his old sedan, but in a rented black Tesla. Of course. He stepped out wearing a tailored jacket he'd bought with money I recognized, arm-linked with Lydia, who looked exactly as she always had, polished, confident, completely unprepared for reality. Daryl strode up to the door and slid his key into the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again, harder. Then he knocked. "Mildred," he called, peering through the glass. "What's wrong with the key?" That's when he saw it. Even from across the street, I could read his face as it changed. Confusion, panic, disbelief. The store was empty. No counter, no racks, no lighting, no velvet couch, just bare concrete and an old broom in the corner. Lydia leaned in, frowned, then straightened abruptly. "What is it?" she asked. Daryl didn't answer. At 7:20, the first guests arrived. An older couple, dressed in black tie, stepped out of an Uber, glanced at the sign, then at Daryl and Lydia, standing frozen on the sidewalk. The woman said something soft, sympathetic, and they turned right back around. That was when my phone buzzed. "An unknown number." I answered. "Mildred," Daryl whispered. "Where is it?" His voice was pure panic, undiluted. Animal. "The guests are here. The caterers are here. What's happening?" I took a slow sip of wine. "Where is what I asked?" "The store," he hissed. "Our store. It's empty. Did we get robbed?" "Oh," I said lightly. "That project." Silence. I decided not to take it seriously anymore, I continued. "You were right. It was just a project. Just money." Behind him, I could hear Lydia's voice sharpen. "What did she say?" Lydia demanded. "Daryl, what did she do?" "You told me to lighten up," I said. "And you know what? It feels incredible." "You can't do this," Daryl whispered. "You can't." "I already did." He exploded. "I'm going to sue you," he shouted. "I'll call the police." For what I asked calmly. Dissolving an LLC. I own 80% of liquidating inventory I paid for. Terminating a lease in my own name to cover theft. More silence. Guests continued arriving. Each one paused. Each one left. Lydia backed away from him slowly, eyes darting, already calculating escape. I hung up. For 10 more minutes, I watched the sidewalk fill and empty again and again, a procession of confusion and secondhand embarrassment. Eventually, Daryl collapsed onto the curb, head in his hands. Lydia kicked the sign, cursed loudly, and stormed off down the street without looking back. I finished my wine, paid the bill, and walked home. I slept very well that night. The silence that followed the grand opening should have been the end. It rarely ever is. A week passed. Then another. No messages from Daryl. No public meltdown. No vague social media posts about betrayal or resilience. Just quiet. The kind that makes people assume you got away clean. That assumption never lasts. The first call came from an unknown number on a Tuesday afternoon, right as I was leaving a meeting. I recognized the voice immediately, not from memory, but from tone. Indignation wrapped in sweetness. "Mildred, honey, thank God you answered." It was Marianne Swain, Daryl's mother. She spoke as if we were allies in a misunderstanding, as if this was a temporary disagreement that needed smoothing over with the right words. "Daryl is a mess," she said. "He's not eating. He's barely sleeping. Whatever fight you two had, you need to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I replied calmly. "The business is dissolved. The relationship is over." She clicked her tongue. "Don't be dramatic. You promised him that store. You can't just take a man's dream away because you're in a mood." I felt something cold slide down my spine. I didn't take anything away, I said. He stole $32,000 from me. I have the bank statements. There was a pause, a long one. Then she said coolly, Lydia is a lovely young woman. Daryl needs someone creative around him. You accountants don't understand how vision works. I laughed. I couldn't help it. You're asking me, I said slowly, to apologize and fund another store. Yes, she replied without hesitation. It's the right thing to do. I ended the call. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. It was from Lydia Vaughn Consulting Group. An invoice for $25,000. Line items included brand realignment strategy, $15,000, vision casting, $5,000, emotional labor and creative support, $5,000. I stared at it for a full minute, then laughed so hard I had to sit down. Natalie did not laugh. She read the invoice once, jaw tightening, then pulled every document we had. The LLC agreement, the bank records, the hotel receipts, the transfers to Lydia's accounts. She sent a single polite letter, not to Lydia, to the district attorney's office. Lydia was CC'd. Her website went offline within an hour. Daryl tried to sue. He found a lawyer willing to work on contingency and demanded $150,000 for breach of contract theft of intellectual property and emotional distress. Natalie sent back one box. Inside it, the operating agreement with the dissolution clause highlighted every fraudulent charge documented, and the lease termination agreement with the penalty receipt attached. Daryl's lawyer called the next day, not to argue, to apologize. He dropped Daryl as a client effective immediately. A month later, the dust settled. Daryl moved back in with his mother. Lydia vanished. The caterers, the printer, and the rental company chased him for unpaid bills from the gala. The dream collapsed under its own weight. As for me, I moved into a smaller apartment. 1 bedroom. Clean, quiet, entirely mine. I drink cheaper wine now, sometimes beer. I sit at my kitchen table with my laptop open reviewing spreadsheets that don't lie to me. The final cost, about $45,000, $32,000 stolen, $15,000 for the lease termination, minus what I recovered selling the fixtures. It's the most expensive lesson I've ever paid for. It stings. I'm not a hero. I wasn't brave. I was an idiot who confused love with trust and generosity with obligation. I let someone see my seriousness as a weakness, a tap they could turn and drain. So I did what I do best. I assessed the risk. I cut the loss. I liquidated the asset. I heard from a mutual friend that Daryl tells people I'm cold, calculating, sociopathic. That's fine. I can live with that. It's a lot better than being the woman who took love seriously and paid for it for